This is Eyewitness News Conference. From our studios in Boston, here's Andy Hiller.
Good afternoon. Our topic today, Proposition 2.5. Will it survive the state's fiscal crisis, or will it be changed? Anticipated cuts in Beacon Hill's local aid, which has become the lifeblood of local budgets, is increasing pressure on 2.5 as cities and towns look for new revenues and look at property taxes. Though 2.5 is still very popular, a recent poll for the Boston Globe and WBZ TV indicates 2.5 no longer enjoys the support among state voters it had in 1980 when it was approved by a 60-40 margin. When we asked registered voters whether 2.5 should be changed to allow local governments to raise more revenue, 39% said it should, and less than half said it should not. Still, more than half of the registered voters we surveyed said Proposition 2.5 has been good for the state. Our guests today, Barbara Anderson, who spearheaded the effort to get Proposition 2.5 passed and is leading its defense now, and Arlington Town Manager Donald Marquis, who's proposing a change to 2.5 that may be on state ballots next year. Our panelists today, John Henning from Eyewitness News and Wayne Woodlief, chief political writer for the Boston Herald. First question, how vulnerable is 2.5 right now, particularly given the mounting financial problems at the state? Why don't we start with you?
Under normal circumstances, that is an open debate in the daytime, I don't think 2.5 is vulnerable at all. I think there's no inclination on the part of the House, possibly not even on the part of the Senate, to change Prop 2.5, and no reason for them to do it. What I am afraid of, and I'm always afraid of, is the all-night session like the one we had last July, when bills come pouring out and strange amendments are attached and they just throw up their hands and forget even trying to be responsible and do almost anything. I am afraid of a session like that. And under a circumstance like that, 2.5 could even be repealed. Have you heard any rumors or any speculation or suggestion there will be that, or is that just a scenario you fear because... I fear it because it's happened before. It's the modus operandi when they can't deal with things out in the open and they don't want to deal with things in the open. They go into an all-night session, have everybody exhausted, then the leadership can sort of push things around and just anything can happen. I think they don't want to do that, but I'm afraid they're going to panic because the fiscal situation is so bad at the state level. But under normal circumstances, I don't think there is any inclination to change Prop 2.5. And if they change it, I think they would probably go the route that Don is suggesting and put it on the ballot and let the voters make that decision. What would you say, Mr. Marquis?
Well, I'd like to go back a little bit and to when 2.5 was passed. I think most people expected when 2.5 was passed for local spending to be cut, and also for state spending to be cut. What happened is that 2.5 affected cities and towns quite differently. As I recall, about 50% of the cities and towns had to cut substantially, and 20% of the cities and towns had to cut the full 15%. Now, in Arlington, that meant that we had to cut approximately $5 million. The accumulated loss since then has been about $60 million. So these were substantial cuts that we sustained. Obviously, we cannot continue to implement 2.5 unless the state continues to give us more local aid. If it's not forthcoming, I think the cities and towns are going to be caught between a rock and a hard place. And we either get it from the state or we're going to have to get it from the taxpayers. Now, everybody understands that nobody wants to pay more taxes. But I don't think the cities and towns have much of a choice. We're either going to get more local aid from the state or we're going to have to get additional revenues from the taxpayers. Now, if the state does not come through with additional local aid, I think that the local officials have to begin to put more pressure on state officials and work together and put the question on ballot and hopefully convince the taxpayers that without additional aid from the state, we must get that help from the taxpayers.
Barbara, what's wrong with having it put on the ballot? You trusted the voters to pass Prop 2.5 in the first place. Why not? Why not put it to the voters again in case it's outmoded? That's been our recommendation all along. Many changes have been made to 2.5, and we've worked with the legislature based upon our membership poll that showed us what our members were willing to accept as changes, and those changes have all been made. And our recommendation every time someone in the legislature brings up the subject of changing 2.5 is that if you really think that the voters want to change it, why don't you put it on the ballot? And the legislature can do this as a non-binding question, certainly themselves, and ask the voters what they think. And certainly if the voters want to make a change, then the voters have every right, I think, to make that decision. It's their Proposition 2.5, it's their law, and but I don't think the legislature should make that change.
And if Don wants to go to the streets and get the signatures and put it in the ballot, there's nothing wrong with asking the voters.
Don, why don't you explain the changes you want to make? I don't know if everybody's familiar with that.
Well, I think that unless we can get that additional aid, which it looks as if we're not going to get now, it seems to me that we must go to the voters and explain that there are some cities and towns that were hard hit. For instance, Arlington, as I mentioned earlier, we had to cut $5 million. Going into next fiscal year, we're going to be short by, our tax losses next year will amount to $7 million. Now, to put this in perspective, if the federal government had to cut 12% of its budget, as we are going to have to, because of these losses, the entire budget deficit would be wiped out in 1 year.
But what are you asking as a change to the Prop 2.5
what we're talking about now is that what I would like to see is that for those communities that had to roll back the full 15%, who don't have any more free cash on hand, whose tax rate below 1.5, who have no excess capacity, those communities are up against the wall and they need some help. And what I'm suggesting is that I would hope that the legislature would recognize that and adjust Proposition 2.5 so that we might be able to assist those communities. As I said earlier, not all communities were affected equally. There are some communities that are really hurting because of 2.5. It is those communities that we need to help. And I'm suggesting that we modify Proposition 2.5 to help those who are really...
That's already built into 2.5. You put it on a ballot, you send it to the voters in that community, and if they want to override Prop 2.5, they vote to override, and if they don't want to override, they vote against it.
Well, that's true. But I think most of the cities, most of the communities that are overriding Proposition 2.5 are the very small communities.
That's not necessarily true at all.
Well,
there's
only been one city, to my knowledge.
Overrode.
Milton just
Cambridge
did the other
overrode.
day, didn't they? Milton just
And Milton
But that's
overruled.
because it's not put on the ballots in the big cities.
Well, I think what's happening is that those small towns that have been able to override 2.5 are those towns where the same people who vote on town budgets in the open town meeting are the people who are voting to override 2.5.
That's not necessarily true at all.
So you have those people who are well informed on the issues, and they understand exactly what's going to happen in their own communities unless they override 2.5. That is not the case in large cities or large towns.
What about in Arlington? Have you had it
We've had 2 override attempts in Arlington 2 years ago, and both of them were badly defeated.
Is that because the citizenry wasn't educated enough?
Well, I suppose you have to conclude that, but I think, as I said earlier...
Why would you have to conclude that?
The conclusion is the voters in Arlington didn't want to override. In some communities, they want to. It's their decision. It's their property taxes, their town, their services, their homes. And I see no reason not to simply trust them to make the decision.
Let me ask you this. What do you think would happen if the federal government or the state government had to go on the ballot to ask voters to approve any tax increase? It would never be approved.
Well, what would happen? The deficits at the federal level we have now.
What would happen?
We don't have that option.
What would happen if the public utilities went to the ratepayers to ask for an increase? Obviously, people don't want to pay more taxes.
That is not obvious because roughly half the time the overrides pass. And in other states that have tried to do a Prop 2.5, usually it fails. So the voters are reluctant to have tax limitation because it's sort of iffy and chancy. And they will vote for overrides, and they will vote for new taxes if they are convinced the money is being spent wisely, and if they trust the officials who are selling them the override, and if they can afford it. And I think a problem you might have now is people are very, very nervous about this fiscal crisis at the state level, and they aren't too sure.
Well, they should be.
Yes,
because
they certainly should be.
Before Prop 2.5, how big was the portion of your budget that came from local aid?
I would say in 1980, we received about 15% of our budget.
And now it's probably between 35 and 40%.
No, it's still, it's about 28% in Arlington.
Well, then you're low, though.
Yes, well, Arlington
Most cities and towns have at least a third of their budget comes from local aids, on the towns anyway.
That's correct. I think Arlington, through the years, has never received its proper share of
So
local
up on
aid.
Beacon Hill, they say, what are you still yelling at us for on local aid? We've been giving you more than your fair share and dedicated to local aid. You've got to clean up your own house if we have to clean up our own house here on the hill.
Well, as I said earlier, I think some cities and towns may be able, at this point, to still live under 2.5. But there are some that, as I said earlier, they don't have any more free cash. They have no excess capacity, which means they have taxed themselves to the limit. And their tax rates are below 1.5. It is those cities and towns that need that help. Let's not forget as well, that the legislature committed itself to 40% growth tax receipt return to the cities and towns, and so did the governor when he ran. When he ran for governor, he said
but he won't
that
be
he would
governor
promise
forever.
But it's not the governor, and Don was very, very active with us in 1981 to get that local aid in the first place. The problem last year is that when the governor stole $91 million from the cities and towns,
Tough word.
when he stole $91 million that belonged to the cities and towns from the lottery money, the cities and towns did not complain about it. And the problem was they sent a message to Beacon Hill last year when the mayor said it's okay for the governor to take this money because we know he needs it for his presidential campaign. They sent a message to Beacon Hill. 1, we don't need the money. 2, we're not going to fight back. We're easy. And I knew last summer they'd get level funded because they didn't fight back last summer. But in fact, then when we saw this happen, we were surprised too that they didn't fight for the local aid. We certainly did, and Jack Flood did, and the Republicans did. We then studied the situation, and we found out that the local aid increases since 1981 have given them a 25% increase after inflation in local revenues. So in fact, in the aggregate, and that may not be true of Arlington necessarily, but in the aggregate they've done very, very well since Prop 2.5. The cities and towns can get along this year, and we did back up Chairman Volk on his level funding for this year. They can get along this year, but Don's right. I mean, they had to break a commitment to do it. They owe us something. They owe us a relief from some of these state mandates, for one thing, just to make up for this. And we hope to get back on track soon with the sharing of the growth revenues.
Mr. Marquis, let me ask you something. When you proposed your change to 2.5, you said that you didn't think the governor and the legislature have the guts to change 2.5. Those were your words.
That's right, I said that.
When you say they don't have the guts, who's holding a gun to their head that is somehow making them weaker than you think they ought to be?
I think it's people like Barbara Anderson here.
And what is the gun that she is holding to her?
Well, I think that, quite frankly, if the legislature did change Proposition 2.5 in a significant way without proper discussion, I would expect Barbara to put it on the ballot and have the people vote it down again.
And theoretically, just to continue this, if the legislature changed it without proper discussion and the people then you anticipate would vote it down, why should the legislature do something if they're elected to represent the people that you say in advance the people would not want?
I think that state officials and local officials must get together, and perhaps with the help of Barbara, and get a real discussion going, because we are going to be facing a crisis. And I'm not saying that it ought to be changed across the board. I think there are cities and towns that need some additional help. And as I stated earlier, those that don't have free cash, those that have taxed themselves to the limit, those whose tax rate are below 1.5, and those who had to roll back when 2.5 was passed 8 years ago.
And those who aren't particularly efficient, and those who...
No.
It doesn't
necessarily follow.
Determine it. They know what's going on in their communities, and they know if an override is needed, and they will make that decision, Don. I don't see what the problem is.
Well, that's easy to say, but I think what's happening is that where it is being overridden, it is in those small towns where, as I said before, the same people who come in at the town hall to vote on budgets, they go out and vote on the override.
Not a small town. Milton's not a
but
small town.
But 99% of those communities are very small, and that's how they're able to do it. I don't believe you're going to have large cities overriding 2.5, and I don't think you're going to have large towns doing it.
Cambridge overrode, though Cambridge, of course, is not typical. Nevertheless, it's a very large...
What is it about large towns? I mean, what is it about large towns and the amount of people that go to the polls that make them impervious to 2.5 overrides?
Well, it's not necessarily large towns. I think the better question is how come they're being passed in small towns? And as I said, it's the same people doing both. In large towns, the plain fact is that people don't want to raise their taxes.
Do they not want to raise it because do they not want to raise it because when you say that you're taxed to your limit, they feel that they're paying to their limit? What is the part of the equation that has to do with questions about the efficiency of the local government? What part of the equation has to do with questions about whether local officials in the past cried wolf? How do those factor in?
I think that the people, what's happening is that people, when they see what's happening in Washington or Boston, they read the horror stories, they believe that the same thing applies.
Boston has balanced budgets, and they lowered their property taxes.
Well, that's because they're getting a lot more local aid than they should be.
Well, going on a turn here, you're talking about the uninformed, the people who really don't know the ins and outs and nuts and bolts of the cities and towns who are voting not to override.
That's correct.
Would you include in them the members of the House of Representatives up on Beacon Hill who don't want to pass any new taxes, and the members of the Senate who up until now apparently don't want to pass new taxes either?
Well, no, they don't want to...
The House just passed a no new tax budget, which is over on the Senate side now. level funded everything. Don't they understand over in the House side?
Well, let's not forget that the state budget is still going to go up anywhere from 4 to 5%. The revenues are projected to go up between 7 and 8% at the state level.
They're not going to do that. They're only up 4%
so
far.
So the budget's going up anywhere from 4 to 5%. Now, as I said before, the governor ran on a pledge to return to us 40%. If the state budget is going up 4 and 5%, why isn't the local aid also going up 4 and 5%? If the local aid were going up 4 and 5%, that would mean probably $700,000 to the town of Arlington.
Well, but look at the situation up on the Hill now. It's chaotic with the budget. 8 weeks away from the end of fiscal 89, the beginning of 90, the Senate is calling for a freezing in spending and hiring and for a whole new plan. They certainly don't seem to have the leadership to handle this situation right now. Wouldn't you say that?
Well, that's because they spent money that they didn't have it.
So did you, apparently.
No, we can't do that. In Arlington, we're going to have to cut back we're going to cut our budgets by $2.5 million. We have an override coming up in June. If that doesn't pass, we have to cut our budgets by $2.5 million. We can't spend money we don't have. But apparently, the governor and the legislature is just plain walking away from the commitment of helping the citizens.
Well, actually, they gave a lot of local aid last year just because, and it was their own fault because they fooled around with the revenue numbers again. They ended up giving them almost all of the increase in state budget last year. But that doesn't change the fact that Don is right. I mean, they promised 40% of growth revenues. They should be giving it. It's a shame we're in the middle of a fiscal crisis, which was totally unnecessary. And that doesn't change, again, the fact that they don't have the money. And so for this 1 year, we looked at the numbers, we looked at the data, and we backed up Chairman Volk on the level funding because we think the cities and towns can handle it for this year.
You think what's happening at Beacon Hill is 1 year?
If anyone shows any leadership, I think what Chairman Volk has tried to do is get control of the fiscal 90 budget. And I think he's made a step in that direction at any rate. The problem is fiscal 89, which is a complete disaster because they simply prostituted themselves with the governor's campaign last year.
But the Senate chairman...
So that is a bigger problem than anyone...
But the Senate chairwoman says that the
right.
fiscal 90 budget submitted by the House is several $100 million off, and they're saying that that they're going to be off FY 89 for $250 million.
But keep in mind that if they had simply accepted the governor's budget, it would be another $700 million off. So, we've all known since last summer, at least, we've known that it's out $1 billion. 89 is at least $1 billion in deficit.
I think people
they have
hear
to
these
deal
numbers.
with that.
I think people hear these numbers and they say, what is going on here? There are $1 billion out here, there are $250 million out here.
It's just a complete fiscal mess because of 5 years of overspending. And the governor's budget went up 70% with inflation of 25%. And then we couldn't deal with it when it was a minor problem because of the presidential campaign. Now it is a full-blown fiscal crisis. There's no doubt about that. And in the middle of that, you're not going to get more local aid, and shame on them. I understand.
With all this uncertainty, though, Barbara, doesn't it make some sense to give the local governments, those which presumably know the people best, some option to exercise their own their voting
they do have
as
an
representing
option.
the people?
They can explain the situation to their voters, and they can ask for an override, and the voters will make that decision.
Well, but I remember I think it was 87, didn't you oppose reducing the two-thirds override vote to simple majority? And didn't that pass without any real disruption to Prop 2.5?
The two-thirds vote was changed in 1981 to a majority vote except for an extraordinary override. 2 years ago, they went to a majority vote for everything. We objected, but not too strenuously, because we recognized that once you had a majority vote, you had Prop 2.5 carved in stone. The only argument right now for a legislator to use to change 2.5 is, I'm sorry, the voters in my community are too stupid to make this decision. They reached their height of intellectual achievement when they elected me. And the legislator isn't going to say that. It has nothing to do with courage, Don. The thing is, they know what the voters want. They respect the voters in their community, and they're going to let them make the decision on 2.5.
I think it's important for voters and taxpayers to understand one other thing, though. In Arlington, in the last 8 years, our overall budget has increased by 32%. Now, if you look at the state budget, it has doubled in the last 7 years. We have eliminated 25% of our employees, teachers, police, fire, public works people, 25%. And at the same time, at the state level, they were increasing their employees by 25%. So you have, I think people have to understand who the big spenders are.
Yes.
You're saying the state government has been piggish.
The state government has all the money it wants. It has not been sharing.
No.
Well, maybe not this year, but up until this year, they were literally rolling in money.
But everybody kind of had all the money they wanted up until this year. The local governments got a lot of money, a lot of programs got a lot of money, a lot of commissions got a lot of money, and the state did get a lot of money. But that's kind of the past. And now...
Well, we can't forget the past, however.
Well, the past doesn't have... The fiscal past doesn't have very much to do with the fiscal present as it's being... Let me ask you this. What do you think the mood is of the average taxpayer in Arlington? Do you think it's... What do you think?
I would say the average taxpayer in Arlington does not want to pay any more than it has to. I think that if we could somehow get their attention as to what's truly happening in Arlington, how we've been forced to cut back, how we've been forced to close schools.
But if you've already done that, why hasn't it captured their attention, or why hasn't it sufficiently captured their attention to make them want to do something about it?
I think it's because it's the overall mood that they don't trust local officials, state officials, federal officials.
I wonder why
and I
that
think
happens.
well,
not you personally, but why don't they trust government?
well, they see what
Don't trust that
they
voice.
see what's going on in Washington and Boston, and I think they believe that the same thing must be taking place in their local government. That is not the case.
For instance, has solidified
So-
our idea of what government is like. Every day in the Herald particularly is running these stories, and the Globe's doing it too. Every single day the headlines of what government is really like and the people who are ripping off the system and abusing the public trust. People are, I'm sure in Arlington as well as everywhere else, completely outraged, sick of it, and fed up. And it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with how they feel about you or the town of Arlington, but I think their feelings about the others make them a little reluctant to give anybody any more money, and I don't blame them.
And you agree?
I agree, and I think that's why we need more help from the state. If it's not forthcoming, then we somehow must get through to the taxpayers that if we don't get it from the state, we're going to have to get it from the taxpayers, or else we're not going to be able to provide basic services in education, police, fire, public works. We've got to
And then what's going to happen?
Well, what's going to happen is we're not going to be able our school systems are going to go down. Right now, we've got fire apparatus out of service in our stations. We've got the bare minimum of police patrolling our streets. We've had close to 100 teachers through the years laid off. We're going to lose another 20 this year. We're going to have to lay off another 20 town employees this year. Eventually, you're not going to be able to provide the basic services. And the quality of life in all these communities will drop right down.
It's their quality of life, Don. It's their services. And when you want more money for those things, then you explain them to your voters. I just don't see what the problem is. Am I missing something
I'm
here?
struck that here the two of you are on the opposite side of this issue, and yet neither of you have said anything good about Governor Dukakis. Is he simply irrelevant to what's going on in the state now?
Well, you know, the fact that the governor, as Barbara said earlier, literally stole $91 million of local aid. And
you think he did that too?
Yes, absolutely. And we had, you know, it's funny. Several years ago, when the economy was really booming, they used to underestimate the revenues. And the cities and towns would get less in local aid. And when we started complaining, they told us that they would set up a rainy day account, and they put all that money in that account, thinking that when times get tough, we'll give it back to you. Well, times got tough last year, but what the state did is they took all that money that was supposed to be for us to bail themselves out.
But return with us now to last year and remember what the scenario was. The governor had an appointment to catch a plane to Atlanta, Georgia, and become the Democratic nominee for the presidency. And when they did, quote, steal the money, not too many members of the Massachusetts Municipal Association were roaming the hallways up there, gnashing their teeth about the governor stealing the money. They were on the train. They were on the plane going out, and they weren't screaming last year. Now that he's lost, now he's a thief.
Well, that doesn't apply to all municipal officials. I can recall many, many times talking to Frank Keefe about how they deliberately, in my opinion, underestimated the revenues. We didn't get as much as we were supposed to. We were supposed to get 40%. We got 30%.
But reporters were reporting on that. I certainly was. There were other reporters on the Hill saying that these things were happening, but nobody cared. Everybody was caught up in this scenario. Potomac fever.
Well,
good expression.
I don't defend Governor Dukakis too often, but don't you think it's a little bit easy to look at the state's money problems, which are caused by problems with the state economy, look at people's mood, look at the stories that you cite about what's going on in state government, and somehow make the governor the villain in the story?
The governor is the villain, and there should be no doubt whatsoever about that. The governor lied to us about the state revenues, about his balanced budget. He stole the money from the cities and towns. He raided the state pension fund, raised taxes, pushed all this through, forced it on the House and the Senate, and it is his fault and his responsibility. He is the governor.
Oh, you agree?
Well, the governor is the leader of the state. I would say that the legislature is perhaps even more to blame than the...
At least that spreads... we're really out of time. At least I get the blame spread around a little. Back in a moment with a final word. Just before we go, quick thanks to our guests today, Barbara Anderson from Citizens for Limited Taxation and Don Marquis, Town Manager of Arlington. Also thanks to our panelists, John Henning from Eyewitness News and Wayne Woodlief from the Boston Herald. Next week on Eyewitness News Conference, we'll be talking more about the state budget with State Representative Richard Volk and State Senator John Over. I'm Andy Hiller. Enjoy what's left of this Sunday. We'll see you in a week.